Welcome. I'm sitting here with Stephen Taylor, the Director of Innovation in Learning and Teaching at the Western Academy of Beijing. We're talking all things learning through the pandemic, getting to know a little bit more about schools that were able to not only survive, but thrive through a very difficult time to reimagine the way we do school. So welcome, Stephen.
Hi, Joseph. Thank you.
Stephen, do you mind introducing yourself a little bit more about what it is you do at WAB and a little more what WAB is?
Yeah. So my main role at WAB is the Director of Innovation in Learning and Teaching, but that role only really kicked in as the school closure began back in late January for us. So I started the year as a MYP coordinator and science teacher, and the new role of Director of Innovation in Learning and Teaching was supposed to begin in August. But as this all happened, we needed to get things going a bit quicker to get the school ready to work online and to try to see how things would play out. So through that time, I was kind of doing both roles. And then the last kind of month or so, as the school was able to open up more and more, I was acting high school principal on site. But that was, the rest of the high school leadership team were doing lots of the work in the background online, but from different places. But as we were able to open up more and more classes, it was just a body on the ground to act as their proxy. So now that we're heading into the new school year and thinking ahead to the new school year, the role can kind of continue. We have a new MYP coordinator coming in. We have a new head of EdTech and IT who was able to join us, Kevin Crouch, back in April, but remotely. And that's been a huge help too, because this has required lots of really things to move forwards quite quickly in order to make it sustainable and workable. And I think if people don't know Western Academy Beijing, it's quite a future-focused school. It's 25 years old now, and it has the mission to connect, inspire, challenge, and make a difference. But it has very strong core values too, has a Gonghe spirit and China global coherence, and other kind of core values and beliefs that actually really help the school adapt to this time of change. Alongside that too, the school's been going through a process called Flow21, the Future of Learning of WAB. And with its 21 targets, many of those things that we had to suddenly start to do were already kind of on the roadmap for things that we would be needing to do as a school anyway. And that helped put us in good stead, I think, as an adaptable, creative community. It was tough. Like it's been a tough few months, and I think we're probably one of the first schools in the world that went online because of this. So it was the Chinese New Year break when we got the word that we wouldn't be able to open the following Monday, but we were open the following Monday, doing everything online. We didn't predict that it would become such a long thing. So the initial planning was really along the lines of, are we ready to keep things running for a couple of weeks or 2 or 3 weeks, 4 weeks maybe, until we get back on campus. So people have had experiences like SARS and things in the past, or, pollution days or bad weather days or other emergencies in different schools, where the thinking was you just keep it going until we can come back again. But that didn't happen. So then we ended up basically, I think it was 18, 19, 20 weeks of online learning. And so that required us to adapt multiple times through the period, and to think about what's in the future, what's more sustainable, what's more creative, what's better in line with who we are as a school. It's been a really interesting period. Now we're in the break. We finished on June 13th. We had hoped to run some summer program activities for kids who are here. We've put together some materials as well for students who aren't here, so they can keep their learning going online if they want to. Really just making visible all the subscriptions and suggestions and things. There's no kind of direct teacher involvement there.
Mm-hmm.
But then the night before the summer program began, we got word that the second wave had closed the schools down again. So that's where we are right now. Now it's kind of early July. We are planning to return on 1st of September. But we have teachers, we have about 50% teachers and students in different places. And alongside that, then we have new teachers to onboard and lots of teachers to try to get back. So it's fun times.
Yeah, so it's been certainly one of the most difficult, 5 or 6 month stretches of school, of education that I can remember. I'm sure that's the case for most people. And at the same time, you're wearing all these different hats, transitioning to new roles, filling in for other people that are stuck outside of the country. Before we get into the school's response to the pandemic and where you are now, I want to bring it back to just a personal level, because I think a lot of people have, through all of this, realized that the power of that school is ultimately or a lot about creating human connections and a social and emotional experience. So do you mind sharing just a little bit about what this experience has been like for you, emotionally, and how maybe this WAB helped to accommodate some of those difficulties that maybe you're facing?
Yeah, that's a good question. Throughout all of this, and I've said this to people many times, there's no other school I would be at through all of this than WAB. Like the community at WAB it's quite strong, it's together, it's creative, there's lots of celebration. From the beginning, the school made sure to look after everybody. So kind of the reassurance, the constant updates, like a Yammer channel was created to give people kind of reliable information as it goes along. There was some emergency WeChats in case there's things we needed to know. The head of business, director of operations, and the head of school were wonderful in making sure that people were safe, to the point where, we were, wherever we were, we would be okay. And the updates about what's happening and the reassurance that jobs are okay, I think has been good. The school's been very transparent, right? Sharing information as soon as it's been verified and is relevant. So not jumping the gun on things, but making sure that the right information's in people's hands. Because it was a panicky time, right? Everybody's worried about what's happening next. And the timing was awful, right? During Chinese New Year, and there's people scattered all over the planet. A couple of weeks later, would be in a very different story, right? We see some other schools that closed later in different countries, Japan, for instance, with a bit of warning and time to get ready. But if everybody on campus, everybody on site, makes for a different story, right? Like I have, so I'm married, I have 2 kids, my wife's Indonesian, and I have a daughter who turned 13 during this, and a son who turned 9 during this. We were in Wanlong, north of Beijing, when it began, but we ended up actually in Indonesia for the first month. And we went there just because we were in quite a small apartment to find space to be with Hesti's mum, to hopefully get a reliable internet connection, and understanding how heavy all the work was about to become. And we thought we'd booked flexible tickets. And so we booked for a month, and we might come back after a couple of weeks. And if we burned a bit of money, we're okay. It didn't turn out that way. So then we had to go to Malaysia because my visa ran out. And then we finished on the way out of Bali back to Beijing. And we made it home by a day. And it was that time, again, suddenly rules changed, things changed, that the families before were doing quarantines at home, and then there was a period where families were getting separated, and then for us the best possible outcome would have been of the options that were available then would have been I did the quarantine alone, and the family was able to do it in their home, and we made it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the flights a few hours later, they got redirected to other cities. And then that didn't last long either before the borders closed completely. So even though it's been, I think, the toughest thing anybody's done for years, we're still thankful every day that we're here and we're together. We think about the community that we're serving and the nature of what international schools are, right? We have lots of families that are separated and have been separated for months. And I just can't imagine how tough that would be. I don't think I would have been able to thrive through that if I'd been separated.
Right, and so it speaks a little bit to the power of the power of all schools as community, but you've used that word several times to describe WAB, that having a strong community that and that's something that has been able to it sounds like it's been a lot of hard work. It's been very stressful, and there's been a lot of uncertainty. And but for some people, that maybe that with their families and their connection to their school or their work has been maybe the most consistent thing through all of this.
Yeah, and that's the idea of consistency is quite an important thing as well, right?
Right.
Like we recognized early on that for many of our kids and families, this is the one thing, the education that we provide is one of the one things that is the constant. And that it was important from the beginning, and especially as we understood this was going to run longer, that what was being provided was high quality, or as high quality as it could be. And we saw kids once some kids started to come back to campus as the middle and high schools reopened. There were kids who hadn't left their apartments in months, right? So there wasn't an awful lot else that they were engaged with through all that time that wasn't school,
right.
And certainly not other people. So the responsibility we had as a community to look after each other, even just by doing the best we could to provide what they know or to provide the learning, it was high, right? And you could feel that. You could feel that weight of responsibility all the time. Kind of second guessing decisions that we've made or worrying about, are we doing the right thing? Every decision becomes harder, especially when people are working across time zones and you don't get that real human sense of, does somebody really agree with this or not? And are we really on the right path here? And then there are times we just have to decide and go for it, and things need to be made visible and communicated clearly, just to hold it together. So there's a lot of background work went on. Like there were weeks, everybody was busy, right? Teachers worked harder than ever before, I think, to try to stay connected to their classes, to stay on top of things, to plan in a new way. And at all levels of the school, people were working way more than before, and more tired for it, for sure.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about, you mentioned it, that when all of this first started, that you had some people in your community that had been through SARS or H1N1, and there was a stance or an approach that maybe said maybe this will be a few weeks. Do you want to walk us through a little bit about what that initial response was to the pandemic, go a little bit deeper with that, and then when that transition happened, when it seemed like, okay, this is not just a couple weeks.
Yeah. So that was the whole thing began during that break, and the first messages were, are we ready to open online on Monday? And so it was kind of at the first level was with the systems people, the different levels of school leadership going, are we good to go? One of the big benefits of WAB is that we have a lot of online tools and systems and quite a lot of agile platforms that are used. But it really was, the thinking was, this is going to be a temporary thing, because I think past experiences were like SARS, for instance, An extended closure is extended to a point, right? But then things get back to normal pretty quickly. So our schools, all these schools in this first wave, this kind of late January, early February wave, had no concept of how long this could be, I don't think. So it was more about initially, if people log in next week, will they be able to keep learning, just to keep going across the tasks that they were doing, and then come back and keep on. Then after about a week, 2 weeks, maybe 3, it became really apparent that this was going to be extended. And so the school at that point thought, right, well, we can predict that there'll be basically 3 weeks worth of notice if we're able to reopen. And that would include like a week to have like a spring break and get back to Beijing. And then 2 weeks where we're predicting home quarantine, where the online learning would carry on. And then be back on campus together. So there was a whole chunk of time in the kind of first third where we thought that was possible. And then that didn't happen. And so then the school, after 6 weeks of being online, kind of nonstop, called us a spring break then, a week, where people really needed to decompress. And there was people still scattered in different places with just the holiday stuff they had in their backpacks, right? So that was a week there to think about finding something a bit more stable, a place to be that was a bit more constant. Get back if you could, right? And so our family we were there. We were kind of in Indonesia, and as soon as we got the permission from our local village to say the kids could do home quarantine with the mum, we tried to book a ticket, and we were lucky. But literally after we checked in, 2 messages came through, one saying flights are now going to get redirected, and the other one saying Taipei, which is where we're flying through, was closing. And we made it through both, super lucky. So that's what happened. But so many other families didn't make that, or people didn't get that. So they ended up in place since the end of March until now. Now, as that happened, we also realized this is likely to carry on, if not to the very end of the school year, but to the end, to late enough that we would have to think about how do we finish the school year in this blended or this online mode. And so where the first kind of few weeks focus had been more on keeping the learning going and formative assessment type work, it became apparent that we had to then think about how might we report on this at the end of the year? How might assessment work? What is the fairest way to do this? So to not just write off the year, because the community, the parent community in particular, but also the kids who've kind of really knuckled down through it, wouldn't have responded well to it just be written off. There was a very strong need for us to maintain as much stability as possible. So we ended up with assessment models where elementary school went for narrative in their reporting. Middle and high school tried to unpick as many different scenarios that kids would be in and assess the fairest way possible. So to the high school, in particular, where there's credit implications, where if a student's really had a tough time, for a course to be able to switch to a pass-fail or a pass incomplete, not fail, was an option. But for many, many kids who really worked hard, they wanted the grades to be on their reports, right? They wanted to show that they were able to thrive through this. And so we had all that kind of mapped out and refined as we went through the year. But then also then working with people and trying to focus assessment a bit more, to pull back on the scale of things, conversations that with hindsight we would have had to have anyway, but this has made everything a lot more visible. And we can see now the value in streamlining things, providing clearer instructions, giving perhaps more creative elements to tasks, a bit more choice for kids. It was all in line with our flow targets anyway. And it's very much in line with the high quality implementation of our IB programs. So it's really kind of pushed the pedagogical envelope a bit too. So yeah, it was a lot of things, because every decision had impacts on in many ways that we can't predict, right? You don't know how this will land on somebody who might be stuck in another place with limited access to technology, or versus, you know, a child who's been in a Beijing apartment for months. They're all looking at the school for slightly different things. And so we were trying our best to maintain what it meant to be WAB, but provide the fairest solution to most people, all people.
Yeah, so I'm sure to meet these sort of changing focus, and making sure that while WAB remains WAB, that you're meeting the needs of people spread out all over the world in different situations, that the school had to reorganize itself in some ways. The structures, where maybe it's the people, it's the positions, it's the delivery. Can you mind sharing a little bit about how WAB did that to face all these challenges that you just described?
I mean, one of the technological things that worked early on was trying to insist on some consistency about timing and how things are posted or shared with students. So when you're working with the high school, especially the IB students, or the diploma students, sorry, it's actually a bit less difficult in terms of putting that out there, because much of the content for the courses is already organized online. The syllabus is quite concrete. We asked that teachers, initially that first week, because we were trying to work out what was going on, the school asked that teachers maintain Beijing hours. But then that really quickly became obvious that that wasn't sustainable. And so then we switched into like identifying a number of Beijing hours where you will be online reliably for help, and ensuring that through the week you've had video tutorial opportunities, as well as mentor group conversations. And then that things would be posted online by 8:30 Beijing time for that day or for that run of days. And that things would be posted as consistently as possible using Moodle, and in elementary school, the blogs. So that helped, even though it wasn't perfect. Like from the parent perspective, there's still quite a lot of platforms to deal with, but it did help try to keep some consistency. And then from the middle leadership perspective, being able to see who, from the families, like who was able to access things, who needed what other support. From the teachers, you know, who was able to access things, who needed what other support. And then the technology things refined through time, right? Some of the tools that people were using, they fell because it wasn't China friendly, or people having problems accessing them. Others rose throughout all of this. Microsoft Teams really became a powerful ally for us, and helped us actually move forwards some work that we were working on anyway, in terms of identifying core platforms from the school moving forwards. So now we're going to kind of go a bit more all in on Teams in middle and high school. We have some other trials for elementary school, but all professional stuff will happen there too. And it's become a much more powerful tool. Like, it's very different to the tool that it was 8 months ago. And that's been a great useful thing for us, because being in China, relying on Microsoft rather than the proliferation of random things has been helpful. So as we pop out of this into the new school year, we'll see further streamlining of things. Because it did require, like the original question, it did require us to reorganize a bit. But actually we were fortunate that the school and the teachers had done a pretty good job already of organizing. So that side of things wasn't dramatic. Not in the same sense that I think some other schools had experienced. Yeah.
So there were already, it sounds like the seeds for potential success had been planted, long before Chinese New Year this past year. So what do you think some of those existing capacities that the school had the dispositions and mindsets of the people
Mm.
in the school, allowed the WAB community to move forward and still find success in the spring of the in the spring of this past school year.
I mean, like I mentioned at the beginning, the strength of the community was really important, right?
Yeah.
There was, where the Yammer channel for official information was created very soon after, on teacher suggestion, a open discussion Yammer channel was created too, where people could kind of ask questions, get help, post funny questions that people responded to, like all those ways to try to keep people bonded was there. There was pub quizzes on a Friday night on Zoom. The assemblies and the celebrations that the school does, they kept on going through digital platforms. There was all kinds of stuff, right? The showcases of student work still happened. The kind of karaoke challenges, flip grids, sing-alongs, all that kind of stuff was going on that the school's pretty good at. So keeping the community together was good. Then the occasional formal kind of town hall meetings run by the leadership team to say, this is what we know. Okay, this is what's important to know right now. This is how we make sure that you're okay. So that transparency of information was really important too. I think it was great as we started to be able to open up some of the classes again towards the end, to have people physically come together, but also to share back to the community who weren't able to be there that here are some things that are happening and we miss you, but it looks like we're heading back towards something positive. So that was a big strength. The school work and its vision through Flow21 really helped. Like the conversations that have been happening for years about what is the future of learning, what we want for our learners. Well, you couldn't approach this school closure without thinking in those ways. Like a real student-centered learning, where we have to make sure that what we're expecting for our kids is clearly shared, but the ways around it and the different situations students were in, I think, forced us to think more flexibly about how we deliver that, and how do we understand what they know, what support that they need. So that was, the school's mindset was already pretty close. I think that very much helped the adaptation into this way of thinking. There was never a question of us switching into synchronous lecturing, because that's not what the school did. There were times for sure where parents were asking, this is what we want, but maybe that was a demographic of parents that didn't fully understand what WAB was all about, and highlighted the idea that we would, or highlighted the necessity for us to communicate more clearly about what the school's doing. In the early days, before the rest of the world closed, there was probably a little bit more tension there in terms of external perceptions that we would be falling behind, right? But then once it hit the rest of the world, everybody's in it together, right? So like the kids aren't really falling behind. They're learning differently, right? And we'll meet them where they are in the new school year, just as every school around the world will try to do, to do the best for them when they come back. So something that we have to all recognize, I think, is that actually taking a student-centered approach has helped us weather a storm. But if we weren't doing that, if we weren't even trying to do that, this would be much tougher.
Yeah, certainly. This is, in some of these conversations that I've been having, there's a couple things that resonate with what you said, with what other people have said, and that's sort of that. We had to make sure that that our online learning looked like our, was true to the same things that we cared about for our on-campus learning, right? It might look different, the mechanics of it might look different, but the why, and the why we do this, and the how we, and the student-centeredness of it, had to stay real, or that had to stay there. And the other thing is that these terms that we've often used in schools we have found a new, well, two things. First is that our previous conceptions of, for example, of what it means to be student-centered, or what it means to be have good, home school communication, might have been inadequate, and this really forced us to look at, to really make sure that we really are being student-centered, and it's not a word that we're just throwing around because other people are doing that. So can you maybe, so when you talk about student-centered and online learning, what are you talking about?
I think what you're trying to describe is it's time for us to move past the buzzwords, right? Like the words that schools that put on their websites and all this. So,
right.
And it's becoming more important for us as we plan for next year, right? We're not, this whole last period, this last 5 months is more like emergency remote teaching, right? That's how it's been described online, and that's absolutely true. Like, we're all people who were thrown into something, and schools that were, high performing, great schools, suddenly having to extend an online way of learning, but not necessarily be the experts in online learning. So when I talk about the personalized nature of this, or the student-centered nature of this, well, we're still trying to we're still trying to stay true to who we are as a school and give our students the same experience of learning. But there are key elements that are missing, right? That human interaction is missing. The students being able to collaborate and work with each other in physical, real ways is missing. But now we have to learn about new tools to reach those students where they are. So actually being student-centered in that sense, that I have this group of kids who are, perhaps they're struggling to access content in this way. Well, what do I need to do? Do I need to simplify? Do I need to redesign the assessment task? Do I need to think about different ways to reach them? In the high school, there was a very strong culture of mentoring that was developed through this. So part of our flow targets was, what does it mean to be a progress mentor? And the mentoring practices built quite strong relationships in support of each student's success. So even though they're working towards common goals, they're being supported through that individually. Through the sort of first third of it again, the realization that things would be extended, there was lots of curriculum tasks or units had to be tweaked or redesigned to better suit the situations kids were in. So our middle school design teachers did a great job of this, where the tasks obviously that they had planned that would require workshops and things like that, that was no longer possible. So they created a kind of carousel approach where the students' output would be similar in terms of the MYP design cycle, but the projects that they took on better suited the position that they were in. So it could have been digital design, or it could have been something that was more physical, but better using the situation and the tools that they had available. So this idea that they become more student-centered really means the practical realization of meeting kids where they are. And that was facilitated through understanding where we're all going together, but also what tools and strategies we have available. And to that end, then we ended up with lots of professional learning, right? One of the great things that happened, especially through the first half of this, but it carried on going, was lots of WAB labs online. So where, one teacher might be an expert at Teams, was doing little showcase in how to use different functions of Teams, different online tools. There was Flipgrid and all kinds of other things. So a lot of people will describe this as one of the most intense periods of professional development that they've been through, right? And a lot of that high quality learning has come from the people within the community, just testing things out and sharing them with each other. And that in itself allows us to go, I could use this with this group of kids, and then like we're having right now, the conversation, many of those kind of tutorial type small group conversations rather than the teacher to the class. You might have 22 kids. Do you really understand what all those 22 kids know? It's easier when you're in a smaller group. So we found some stronger relationships built between students and teachers, and teachers and teachers have come through this too, right?
So, through all of what you described, how has, what WAB means to everyone, has it strengthened something that, did it strengthen a pre-existing, purpose or meaning that it had for people? Has it changed the meaning for people? Has it added new meanings for people?
Could you ask the question again?
Sure. Sorry. Through all this, what WAB means, the school's purpose, right? For students, for teachers, for parents. How has that changed through the pandemic, or has it maybe strengthened pre-existing?
What does WAB mean? I think one thing that the school always makes sure that it puts that, what does it mean to be a WABby? What does it mean to be a WAB? It always puts that front and center. So I don't think it's changed what it means, but it's provided many opportunities to highlight what it means, if that makes sense.
Sure.
So sometimes when people haven't understood things that we do, perhaps, like if there's perhaps a call for more live lecturing and scheduled classes and everybody's doing it according to the schedule, that's the kind of thing that we weren't really trying to do anyway. We're trying to do more experiential learning, building things in more ways that truly drives inquiry-based learning whilst maintaining high standards. So it provided opportunities, I think, for us to say this is more about who we are. And we're doing it differently because of these reasons. So as learning designers, this is what we'll do. It's a good question, because there's so many different types of international schools who approach things in very different ways. That perhaps the easy thing would be to switch into lectures and tests online. But that would mean taking steps away from what the school believes. And I think that would be an unfortunate thing.
So to show some of the, creating new ways to show, what it means to be a WABby. I'm sure that you had to give yourself permission to do some things, or give yourself space to do some things that you wouldn't have normally done in a routine situation. What are some of those things you had to give yourself permission to do?
As general faculty, or in my role, or as a teacher?
You can speak to your personal experience, and then also some of the things that, as a school leader, some of the things that you had to give others, space to do that maybe you wouldn't have in the past.
That's another good question, right? The permission to do things wasn't something that we predicted that people would be looking for as much, because we thought that permission was implicit in everything. But actually there was quite a few opportunities that people were able to take once it was said, yes, it's okay to try this. Once we made it safe, I think, for people to try new things, to try out a pedagogical approach, or to think about redesigning a unit to offer more choice, where perhaps as middle leaders we thought, well, that might have been clear, but maybe it wasn't in the past. So often it was just the go ahead, right? When people were trying to rethink what they were doing to serve their kids online. And they ran ideas past us. It was nearly always yes. In terms of how do we make this unit, this assessment, or this lesson more accessible. So yeah, the permission thing was interesting. The yes and approach is okay. As long as we're not creating extra burdens. And sometimes it just required like a coaching conversation or a little bit of a problem resolution through, is there a simpler way to do this? Then it was nearly always okay. So offering more choice was a big one, right? Showing learning in different ways other than the standard ways was a big one, right? So some subjects perhaps that might have relied on testing, then the questions would come through about, well, what if kids cheat? Or how do I know if they're doing it themselves if they're not with me? So then that opened up conversations about, well, what are the objectives that we're trying to assess? And are there different ways to do that? And in multiple cases, the realization, what, we can do that? And the response being yes. And it's not limited to being online. You can do it that way back in class too. So let's see what happens when we get back as well. And that was quite an energizing experience. I think it was quite freeing for teachers who were seeking that permission and got that permission just by saying, is this possible? And then, but also it was useful learning, I think, for me and for some other middle leaders too, that we thought that was already understood to be permission given. But I think, and maybe it was highlighted by the fact that we're online, things were much more visible to parents. People are a bit more anxious. But there were quite a lot of check-in emails and questions saying, is this okay? Is this okay? Which helped us get a good picture of the learning. So all of it was good. You know, every question breeds other questions, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's, you know, it sounds maybe like another case of, you know, the things that we say as professionals that don't always, you know, we said, you know, before, student-centered, or, you know, like, of course you have permission, you know, of course you're able to try out new ways of showing learning and things like that, that until, you know, you really, you know, this tested that to a whole new level, and people rose to the occasion, it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, there was, the tension there was, you know, we have teaching teams, right? And the importance of collaborative planning became much more apparent. So some teams that functioned super well through all of this already had a strong collaborative culture within their team. So instead of independently recreating the same task for their kids, for their section, they might be a team that would say, okay, what are our responsibilities and what are our shared students going to get out of this? And so then it was within the team, they were able to say, here's something we could try, here's something I can model. It might work with the kids in your section. And that was really positive. Where some of those things weren't as immediately obvious or easy was perhaps in teams that weren't quite like that, where they were, you know, cooperating. They were collegial and cooperative rather than truly collaborative. And so where it was my section, your section, their section, that's where some of those needed some resolution. But I mean, obviously the way that we're going and the message that we're sending is this is what we're doing from now on, right? A collaborative planning team is responsible as a team for all of the kids, and that will serve the kids in different ways, because it seems like a shame that perhaps one group of kids has a teacher with a specific set of expertise, and another group of kids, teacher has a very different set of expertise. And if all kids were able to access both teachers, then they would all have the benefit of learning from each other, right? And they wouldn't need to be independently creating things, and they wouldn't need to worry about different practices in different classrooms. You know, the teacher always has the opportunity to personalize things. But I think the vulnerability, I suppose, opening up and modeling things and showing, here's something that we could be trying, has really helped some teams move forwards. Yeah. And so that's a kind of evolving conversation with middle leaders, heads of department, and so on as well. Yeah, how do we ensure that we are collaboratively planning teams rather than individual fiefdoms?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so much of what learning looks like is not always dependent on the upper management and leaders. It's those middle teams, right, that
Yeah.
define a lot of what goes on in schools. And so I'm curious, right? While there were some changes that happened, right? Some things had to stay the same. One of those, right, like you were talking about, having strong collaborative culture within teams. What else had to, amidst all the change? What are some other things that were non-negotiables that had to stay in place?
Yeah. So, I mean, we had to maintain the contact days, right? So it's an expensive fee-paying school, right? So there's a side of this where there's lots of parents who've paid lots of money for an education that their perception might be that they have to then deliver a lot of by themselves at home. Mm-hmm. So the ensuring that the quality of what we were doing was visible and explicit to parents was very important. As much as possible, we kind of absorbed that and shielded the teachers from the direct stuff from parents. But we also needed to make sure that things were being done well. As a 3-program IB school, we needed to stay true to what it meant to be that. So using the program structures, principles, and practices, that actually helped a lot, right? Because that's what people know. So similar things with assessment, right? Using the assessment criteria, not making up something new. Heading towards a report at the end that was as close to normal as possible with caveats, right? But and very much an approach that recognized what students could do and had demonstrated rather than a deficit approach, and communicating that as often and as early as possible. That was really important because, you know, in the mind of many of the parents, that's like a measure of the quality of the school. Well, if they have faith in what they're doing, they will still keep things going as normal, without bending completely to switching into traditional methods, right? So we had a lot of parent information sessions that were showing what our learning looks like and what our learning looks like online. And as much as possible, drawing the parallels between those. In the spaces for things like mentoring and advisory class meetings, that all remained, right? That human connection, the ability for kids to work with their teachers and their classmates, that had to remain, right? You can't isolate kids completely. We still had faculty meetings, and they served the kind of multiple purposes of keeping people connected and bonded, but also unpacking some of the issues we had to deal with. What are the next steps? How do we go about these things? As well as kind of delivering really important information. But the adaptation for all these things is then they had to suit different time zones. So we often found that we had multiples and people would join as they could. So quite a lot needed and did stay the same. Key events remained, like the milestones through the year, right? End of year celebrations, graduation, awards assemblies, showcases of student work. All of that was there. I think one thing that got stronger was the PYP exhibition. That team did an amazing job. And so through that period of school closure was the peak work, and they'd already launched their projects. But that peak work that students had to do, I think that really highlighted this. The WAB's PYPX was incredible. And if, you know, they published bits of the students' work online, where you can see the thinking processes, the thinking routines they've been through, the artistic responses to the issues they've dealt with. So that was normal plus, yeah. And that was a nice example of how some positive things have come out of this. Yeah, we couldn't, and then other things that had to stay the same. We couldn't do any dramatic shifts in terms of curriculum content. Obviously, that would confuse people too much. And core platforms had to maintain just to be recognizable and easier for parents to navigate.
Mhm.
But now we know that there's more consolidation to do. So as we come through next year, we have a few pilots to do, but also some more consolidation to make it easier again.
Yeah, maybe, you know, with you mentioned the PYP exhibition as you know, as some example of some normal plus. You know, maybe one of the things that, you know, by doing things remotely like this, that those processes, you're more conscious about making them visible, right? You're not assuming that it's being seen or observed or being done. You're documenting it, and from both the student side and then also the rich feedback that the teachers are giving to students through that process.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a great example of the power of documentation as a learning process.
Mm-hmm.
Not documentation in the fill in the unit plan sense, but from the Project Zero, that making thinking visible approach. Like, what is it that we're seeing? What do we notice in the students' thinking and their artifacts of learning? Mm-hmm. So those kids coming from grade 5 up to grade 6 next year, they're powerful, self-directed learners, right?
Right.
The sophistication of what they've produced is perhaps not what middle school will expect. And so now we need to find opportunities for them to showcase that. And how does that buoyant force push up through the continuum, right? Like, what are these kids going to do to influence the rest of our program over the years? So,
yeah, it's exciting to imagine what those possibilities might be, and that's perfect because perfect segue. Because I'm wondering what changes do you think might stick, you know, when you return in the fall, or when things return to normal, or the next normal. What's going to stick, do you think?
I mean, there's quite a lot that needs to stick, I think, because it's tough to celebrate things at this time, right? It's globally a hugely challenging time. And so it would be kind of in bad taste to celebrate things in that sense. But the positive changes in terms of how we teach and learn that have come through it, we need to reflect on and make sure that they stay. With everything that was like, so much information and feedback and so on was generated over the 6 months. At the end of the year, the CELT team, we worked with Eric Hudson at Global Online Academy to kind of reflect on what makes best practices in online learning. What are the norms and rubrics that might support us moving forwards? And what we found was the things that were quite successful were also in alignment with these best practices. We'll do some more work with them as we move forwards in shaping next year when we have a clearer picture of what it will look like. But some things that we know, right? So we will be opening with teachers and kids in different places. So we're going to have to maintain structures that allow us to reach students and teachers in different time zones. And for the groups that have been really successful, that idea that these are our kids, not my kids, is something that we were working towards anyway, but it's become quite apparent that a true collaborative approach better supports all the learners. And that a mildly cooperative approach doesn't, right? And so that's something that needs to stick and needs to be reinforced. To that end, also then making sure that the students and teachers who are here in Beijing are using their time in the best possible ways, and that students and teachers that are online are doing the same thing, whilst also all feeling like part of a whole school, trying not to split two schools. The use of lots of the tech tools and the consolidation of platforms definitely has to stick. That's become a big part of who we are in terms of moving forwards. So that's really key. I think starting to think about us as learning designers and perhaps reducing the scale of big assessment tasks, but focusing it more and adding more creative elements to it, a bit more flexibility, that will stick. Lots of people are really becoming quite comfortable with the way we use time. And that was in our flow targets anyway, right? So the conversations that follow will be, well, what's the long-term impact on this, on the schools, of this on the school's schedule? So we can't go into that minute by minute daily schedule of online lessons. Why would you want to recreate that when we were trying to move away from it to begin with? So the challenge that we have next is, how do we get this perfect blend, this best blend of synchronous and asynchronous whilst working across time zones? Lots of feedback from kids on having more time to work on the things that they need to work on, or they want to work on, or to invest in. You're thinking about cultures of thinking, right? Time as a cultural force. How we choose to invest our time, investing time to make more time, managing the energy that we have rather than counting the minutes that we've got, is lots of great conversations for us to follow with this, creating opportunities for something quite powerful. So I really hope that we don't end up slipping back into a schedule exactly as it was before. And as we move through the next few months, where we still have that haziness of who's here and who's not, it's going to allow us to refine that blended model, so that's going to be really interesting. How our school schedules globally might look after this will be an interesting thing to follow up on. So yeah, there's lots, right? What else will stick? What else will stick? The community bonding stuff has to stick. Yeah. And especially if we have new kids, new faculty, new families who join us. That's happened already, but it's going to happen in a bigger way come September, right? People who will be joining the school who will never have physically met anybody at the school. Yeah. So, we have to make the community strong, or keep it strong, sorry, through all of this. So we definitely don't want to lose that side of things. But that's more like maintaining the normal. The normal would have been that we would have been celebrating them anyway. What else don't we want to see return to normal? I think as we move up, the flexibility of thought that teachers demonstrated in finding other ways of assessing, we for sure want that to stick. Mm-hmm. So the move away from testing in that, here's what we think we have to do, into actually, this is what we'll use this tool for more thoughtfully. Definitely want that to stick. And then, more elements of choice in the units for students, yet still building on really solid foundations. Yeah, there's lots.
Yeah, and so I think you said, for the most difficult time in your professional career, and yet all this promise, and all this promise, all of a number of things to celebrate, and a number of practices and mindsets to be optimistic about for moving ahead. So
I think I'll add another one, actually.
Yeah.
Because now that I think about it, right? Because we got quite a big faculty, it's like almost 200 faculty, right? I think one thing that's happened through this period too is new relationships have formed that wouldn't have had the opportunity to form before. Mm-hmm. So people communicating in digital ways across school sections because they're brought together by an interest that might not have otherwise surfaced in the everyday treadmill busy day, right? Yeah. That's been a really powerful thing. Good quality interactions and collaborations across the school through different tools has been really cool. And the the rise of lots of people as champions of different things. I think we've got to maintain that too. The school tries a lot to try not to be a top-down place through this emergency time. There's needed to be lots of leadership level decisions made quite quickly just to keep the school going, right? But in parallel with that, so many people have put their hands up or demonstrated things or shown things or given suggestions, feedback and ideas, become models for different ways of learning or different tools that they've used. We can't let that go for sure. Like there was a growing culture of what we called WAB labs, of teacher to teacher type learning. We know that the chances of anybody getting on a plane for a workshop is minimal, right? In the next however long. So maximizing the expertise that we have in our faculty to build communities through learning, we sure want to see that stick, and not just stick, but become a real driver of how we learn together as a learning organization. Because, you know, new heroes have risen for sure. And we have to champion them.
Yeah, and you know, it sounds like WAB has had a lot of, has done a lot that should be championed to the broader education community.
Yeah.
And in the same way that you're describing teacher to teacher learning going on, I hope that there can be the sort of school to school or organization to organization learning going on, because WAB has a lot to share with schools, not only in the region but across the world. And so, Stephen, I really appreciate you taking the time to give us just a brief snapshot of what some of those things are. Thanks again for your time.
No problem. Thanks for the opportunity. It's really interesting to try to reflect through all of this. I mean, we still have a lot of work to do, right? There's knowing that this is the way it's going to be. I think schools have to plan to be blended now. We definitely want to make sure that moving forwards, that it's definitely more sustainable, more enjoyable, more true to who we are. So even though we're nervous about the coming year, we're kind of looking forward to it too. So I hope this conversation, if we have this conversation in a year's time or 6 months' time, I wonder what will have changed between now and then. So
that's
thank
a
you,
great
Joseph.
idea. Yeah, it'd be great to reconnect. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Good luck.